Okay, so our next presenter is here from Winnipeg to introduce us to her twice great and great-grandfather, Alphonse Leydier, and that's on her mother's side. This particularly story underlined for me both the blessing and the curse of small-town living. We all have stories we could tell about that, but this one, Nadine has been communicating since she decided to talk here with Laurie Nelson and Dorothea Belanger on our committee about her story and working up her story. And aside from that, on behalf of my mother-in-law and my husband, I belong to a Facebook group that's doing family genealogy on the family from Norway, the faction of the family that's from Norway. So I'm happily, checking in on things on Facebook, as we all do, and up pops this promotion for this event today by a man in Norway who's sharing it to the group to say, if you happen to be in Kenora, come on down to this event because your cousin is going to be there talking about her family. And I thought, this is how small the world is getting. This is what's happening now. We're all making these connections. And so it was odd to me that it came from Norway. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna pull out this complicated flow chart that I found and sort of see where everybody connects. And now Nadine's asked for a copy of this because it's actually quite brilliant. And it turns out that, even though she was communicating behind the scenes about her story, she was related through marriage to two of the people who were on the committee of the event that so I thought that was pretty remarkable. Myself and Crystal, our husbands are her, according to the chart, her second cousin. So that was interesting for us to determine that. So after I've said all that, although I should add that my mother-in-law is an Alcock, so there's always an opportunity for an I'm my own grandpa sort of incident when you have that many relatives, they're just everywhere. So there's always an opportunity for that, but that's a Jeffrey Melick story for someone else to tell. So having said all that, Nadine's here to talk about the other side of the family, the Leydier family. So let's give a big Jeffrey Melick welcome to Nadine. Now that she's found her people, she may want to send us all back. We're not going to ever see her again. Welcome, Nadine.
Love my people. That is so very funny, and she's not making any of it up. I do have distant cousins in Norway, but I'm going to be talking about the Leydiers and the ancestry that goes back to France. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the Battle of Sedan, Alphonse Joseph Leydier was wounded. He, along with 102,000 other French soldiers, was taken captive. One of the other French soldiers was Napoleon III, the emperor. Not only was this a significant defeat for the French army, it was the beginning of the end of the Bonaparte dynasty. That man was my great-great-grandfather. So 25 years later, after the War of 1870, Alphonse Sr., he would leave his home in Lagorce, Ardèche, France, with his namesake son, Alphonse Jean-Paul Leydier, and make his way to what was then Portage via New York. My great-grandfather, Alphonse, was born on the 17th of December in 1877 in Ardèche. And as I said, he immigrated to Canada with his father. Alphonse Sr. would go back to France 2 years later to get his wife and the other children. And they were Marie-Justin, Pauline, Agnès, Marias, and Lucie. So the whole family got together back at Portage. A few years later, Alphonse, my great-grandfather, would marry Regina Jeté of Richelieu, Quebec, and their marriage was registered in the Rainy River District. The couple farmed in Jaffrey and Melick and raised their children, including my grandmother, Blanche. I chose to believe that Alphonse Sr.'s experience in battle and in prison along with the lure of a better life in Canada and possibly the prospect of gold, brought him to Rat Portage when he was not a young man. He was 50 years old, and his son was a teenager of 19. Let me just show you where Ardèche is on the map. Oh, I might be needing technical assistance. It's not. Just want to go to the next slide. We seem to have, what did you do differently?
Just woke it up.
Okay, thank you for waking it up. I appreciate that. So as you can see, Ardèche is in the southern part of France, and I like to think of this story as from the caves of Ardèche, France, to the lakes of Rat Portage. And I think of it as the story that came before, the between, which is the now, and the future, which is the beyond. So let me just take you back to the Leydiers of Kenora and where they came from, which was Ardèche, France. It's a small center. It's located southeast of Paris, about 600 kilometers. It's about 10 times that distance from Kenora. It's about 7,000 kilometers. The Leydier ancestors would have traveled from Ardèche to a port. Their transatlantic journey on a steamship would have taken about 8 days. And then they would have had to make their way from New York to Rat Portage. So they arrived in October in New York, and it took them until 1896 to arrive in Rat Portage. Ardèche, let me show it to you because it is stunningly beautiful. One of my favorite stories, a story told by my Nana, Blanche, and she would later become the wife of a local grocer and businessman named Henry Raymond Stevenson. Well, one of Nana's favorite stories was that her father frequently embarrassed his wife Regina by going into town not appropriately dressed, or at least what she considered not appropriately dressed. But my great-grandfather Pa would just laugh at her and say, "It doesn't matter how I'm dressed. When I go to the bank, they call me Mister." I'd like to show you a photograph of that family. So at the far end, you see my great-grandfather Alphonse. Opposite him is my grandmother Blanche. So Paul Leydier was considered one of the area's prominent farmers. He was elected Reeve of Jaffrey Malloch and served for 7 years. He was also president of the Kenora Agriculture Society, and he was a significant property owner. Pa had only one eye when he was an old man, and that sunken, closed eye frightened me when I was a child, but I did love him fiercely. He was my link to my past, to my ancestral family, and he always had an orange in his pocket, which he always gave to me. He died when I was 11 years old. My mother and grandmother and I had traveled from Winnipeg to Kenora because Pa was sick and he had taken a turn for the worse. We had visited him in the hospital. The next day at Sunday Mass at Notre Dame Church, the priest announced that Alphonse Leydier had died, and no one had thought to tell the children, and no one had thought to tell me. So years passed. My great-great-grandparents passed. My great-grandparents passed. My grandparents and my parents are gone too. And since losing them all and going back to France a few times, and I'm going to go back just next month, I've been thinking about my heritage and my Leydier relatives, and I've been on a quest to find them. My Nana, who was born in 1907, didn't talk much about Kenora. I know she was married to a farm girl. She met a handsome businessman and married him. His father, Andreas Silverstein, came from Norway, and that's the family that was alluded to earlier. And my grandfather's father was known as Andrew Stevenson in Kenora. That's a story for another time. So last summer in Kenora, I was thinking about my heritage, my family's, And I wanted to remember them. I wanted to remember the places I'd been as a child. I remember Pa's camps. I remember the deep, cold water, picking blueberries and carrying pots and pans to scare away bears. I remember the hills, the noisy and happy gatherings in full houses, stealing blueberries, or at least it felt like stealing them from the big basket that was always in the hallway. The men grew up and took jobs in town. The women married and took other names, like Sharples and Shigelski and Patterson and Stevenson. Maybe you know some of them. Maybe you are some of them. The Lake of the Woods Museum, and I'm sure it's a place you know well and love a lot. It's a wonderful place to find stories and make connection. I found ancestry stories there. I found news stories online. The Great War Project provides a lot of wonderful information about soldiers and in some detail. And I was able to piece together some stories like this one. The Fighting Leydiers. This article calls my family fighting stock and says that my great-great-grandfather liked to display his wounds. In particular, he was fond of showing off the ear that had been blown off in the War of 1870. It also mentions that my great-grandfather enlisted in the 94th in the Great War. So this shows my great-grandfather's name on the memorial that is in the museum, and beside it is my great-grandfather's veterans card, sort of a Legion card. There's another story, I don't have a slide of it, but it talks about the men from Kenora enlisting in the 94th. It goes into quite a bit of detail, but one of my favorite passages from that news story is this. It was marvelous to see the manner in which the mothers, wives, sisters, and sweethearts bore up when saying goodbye. So Alphonse Leydier, along with a lot of other men in Kenora, enlisted on the 25th of March in 1916. And on June, the 94th Regiment, or Battalion, left for Quebec to what was then called summer camp in Quebec. They sailed from there to Halifax and then to England on the RMS Olympic. Once overseas, Private Alphonse Leydier was transferred to the 17th and then the 74th, and he arrived in France in September 1917. About 8 months later, he was granted a good conduct badge. Not sure how one achieved that. And he was also given a 14-day leave in France. And how I wish I knew what he did when he was back in France as a young man. That December, Alphonse Leydier was transferred back to England, and he arrived in Canada, again via Halifax. When Pa enlisted, his occupation was given as farmer. His description was having blue eyes and brown hair. I never saw Pa with any hair at all. And his age was given as 38. 38 is not a young man, and certainly not a very young age to go to war. There's just a few more clippings about my great-grandparents. So on the one side here is a list of the men who enlisted from Kenora, and on the other side is a notice of the death of my great-grandmother, Regina, and it says that they lived at 422 9th Street North. I've tried to find it, and I can't, so I don't know if it's gone and been redeveloped or what's happened, but I have been looking for that family. So this is a picture of 4 generations of the Leydiers. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about another story about my great-grandmother. She was a small woman, apparently, but she had a big attitude and a big voice. And really, she controlled the household. I'm told she was called Ma, which would go in relation to the Pa, her husband, but it was kind of her word ruled the day. I haven't heard many stories from my Nana and my mother, stories about the Leydiers. And I felt I haven't really known my Leydier family at all, aside from a few pictures. Now, this is one of my very favorite pictures. It shows my Nana and my great-grandfather, and that little boy is my older brother, along with my mother. When I put the pictures together, a story starts to develop, And I'm just going to show you some of those pictures now. So this is a picture of my grandmother with my mother when my mother was a little girl. This is a picture of my mother at the lake. I'm not sure which lake it could be, whether it was Black Sturgeon or Lake of the Woods or Rabbit Lake. This is a picture of my mother as a teenager. She's there with HR, which is her father, and my Nana, Blanche, and my uncles, Conrad, Cuthbert, and Rod, and that's my mother's little sister, Diane, in the front. This is a picture of my Nana and me. She was such an important link to me, to the past, and I miss her dearly. This is a picture of Nana with my mom and my father and the gang of clan that are Delisles. Photo of me with my son in front of a float plane, and a float plane that I just took a photo of last summer when I was here. Sure looks like the same float plane to me. And a picture of me and my son. We went to France at Christmas time. But it's the lake, and the way the lake makes you think about the past and the present and the future. And when I was here last summer looking out to the lake, I wondered even more what was going on here in Kenora, Ontario, when my great-grandfather and his father came here. Well, there were two significant things happening in the 2 years that they came. First of all, in 1896, the first boating building company opened here in Kenora, and in 1897, $25,000 worth of gold bullion was shipped from Kenora. So I think there is something about the mining for gold, looking for a better life, looking for perhaps some prosperity. I know that some of my uncles worked at the mill, and I wandered around the businesses in the streets, kind of looking to get a sense of my family. And this is where I found the best sense I could find of my family. I was walking between the rows of grave markers at the cemetery, Lake of the Woods Cemetery. I was searching. I knew that I could find them somewhere. I was told that they were buried there, and the newspaper stories bore that out. So I kept wandering. Here's a photograph of a gravestone that I found online. And yes, there is an app for it. It's called Find a Grave. I continued walking through the graveyard. I saw a family of deer, but I couldn't find my family. And then suddenly, there it was. My great-great-grandmother's gravestone. I literally walked right into it while I was looking down. So this photograph must have been taken a number of years ago because it's in pretty good shape. This is what the gravestone looks like today. I also found online a gravestone from Alphonse Sr. For me, it comes back in many ways to the between, to the shores of the lake, Lake of the Woods, Rabbit Lake, Black Sturgeon, to me and my family, to my son, to his cousins, and to the beyond. One more photograph of the Delisle family with my mom just about a year before she passed. There are 7 children in my Delisle family, one a twin who died when he was just born. My sister Cindy, who was across from me in this photograph, had twins, a boy and a girl. And one of those twins, Lauren, my niece, is the mother of 2, a boy and girl, and she is right now expecting boy-girl twins any day. So that's why a big chunk of my family can come here, because it's preempted by the birth of twins. I am going to continue to look for my stories. Some of them might be in the time capsule from the Kenora amalgamation, but I might not be here in 2050 when it is reopened. Maybe my son, his cousins, and their not yet born children will be there. I hope so. But I am so delighted to be with you here today. And I'd like to give a special thank you to the organizers, Dorothea, Lisa, Wayne, and Lori. So sitting right here, between the past, the before, and the future, the beyond, we are here in the middle, the between. We are all connected to what came before us and what will come after us. And we are all connected to the beautiful lake of the woods. Thank you for sharing my exploration today.